Hello. I'd like to tell you about some recent research I've done with my colleague, Brian Stewart, at George Washington University. The research is on the effects, both short and long term, of recessions on local labor markets. In this research, we examine how recessions impact or affect local economic activity. We focus on the 5 most recent recessions, those spanning from the mid-1970s through the Great Recession of about a decade ago. We use variation across metropolitan areas in how the employment losses occurred during recessions. The idea being that some areas had a very particularly severe recession, while other areas escaped relatively unscathed. We focus on several outcomes, including employment, population, migration into and out of affected areas, the employment-population ratio, or the share of people in a given area who are employed, and earnings and government transfers that are designed to make up for earnings losses. As a bonus, we also focus on distributional outcomes that affect different groups, particularly inequality. To summarize our results, we find that every recession since 1973 has led to not only temporary but persistent declines in local employment activity. Particularly, 7 to 9 years after a recession ends, we find that areas that experienced a 5% greater loss in local employment lead to a 4 to 8% decrease in employment even 7 to 9 years after recessions end, as well as a 2 to 3% decrease in population, most of which is due to reduced migration rates into the more badly affected areas. Commensurately, we find that the employment population ratio, the share of the people in an area who are employed, also declines by about 2 to 4% or 1 to 2 percentage points. We find several other results as well, including that these losses in employment translate into a 2 to 6% persistent decrease in earnings per capita. The social safety net makes up only a small portion of these losses, less than 30%. So as a result, not only does earnings particularly fall in a persistent way, so do per capita income. We find that changes in the population that may result from these recessions, including in age, education, and the occupations and industries in which people work, can explain less than half of this loss in income. We also find that poverty rates rise, and the earnings losses are concentrated throughout the distribution, not just in the middle. To give you an idea of what the Great Recession looked like across different metropolitan areas of the United States, this map indicates which areas were more or less severely affected in terms of their employment losses. You can see that areas in the darker red were more severely affected by the Great Recession and had greater employment losses. Areas that are in the lighter yellow were less affected. The areas that were more affected span the country, including the west of the United States, as well as parts of the Rust Belt and the Southeast, but areas in the middle of the country, as well as in the Northeast, were generally less affected. The pattern is a little bit different for other recessions. This graph illustrates basically what we're trying to do in terms of comparing employment losses between more and less severely affected areas. If we look at it for the Great Recession, the idea is that the recession begins in that left vertical line at 2007. The line represents the difference between employment patterns for more versus less severely affected areas. So to the left of that first vertical line, the fact that the line is pretty close to zero indicates that more and less severely affected areas were trending pretty similarly in terms of their employment. That's good. That means that one is a good comparison group for the other. When the loss actually occurs between those two vertical lines, by definition, the more severely affected areas experience greater losses in employment. What we're particularly interested in, however, is what happens after that second vertical line when the recession was over. Here we find that the lines don't quite recover back to that 0 point. There's a little bit of a recovery, but the lines remain significantly below that 0 line. This indicates that the areas that were more severely affected by the Great Recession do not recover in terms of their employment growth relative to the less affected areas. In fact, there is persistent relative employment losses, and this persists across a wide variety of specifications that we run. In addition to these employment impacts, as I alluded to earlier, we find several other changes in the composition of the population. Particularly, harder hit areas become persistently older, with the share of the population age 65 plus rising and the share of the population age 15 to 39 falling. We also find that there is generally a persistent decline in the share of workers in high-earning occupations, those generally in managerial, professional, and technical occupations. We find a similar story among individuals with college degrees. The more severely affected areas generally experience a loss in the share of the population with a bachelor's degree or above, and this is generally due to fewer people with bachelor's degrees coming into those areas. However, these compositional changes explain only a fraction of the overall relative declines in employment, earnings, and income. To conclude, we find that recessions lead to not only temporary but persistent declines in local economic activity. The Great Recession, it is worth noting, was not different in this dimension from previous recessions. We find similar outcomes across each of the past 5 recessions. In terms of policy, it's worth noting that the adjustments through the social safety net, the types of transfers that flow to people who lose their jobs or are otherwise severely affected by the Great Recession or any other recession, provide only partial insurance for local labor markets. The outmigration response, interestingly, is negative for recent recessions. That is, we find that people are less likely to move out of a more severely affected area than they would have been in the past. Although we find that government transfers increase, they are also doing so by less than in the past, which means that the social safety net is not fulfilling its function relative to what it had done so 3 or 4 decades earlier. This indicates that the policy focus of the social safety net in providing temporary or cyclical relief from recessions is likely insufficient to fully make up for the persistent losses that people in badly affected areas face. My co-author and I have work in progress that will investigate these channels more thoroughly using individual-level data and federal statistical research data centers so that we can better understand the roles that individual workers and individual employers play in affecting these long-term negative impacts for local areas.